Guys, I just wanted to do a quick video for you so we don't get too far behind in our notes, introducing the literary periods where we're kind of jumping in the middle of American Lit 2 here. So I'm going to start with Romanticism, and we're not studying any works from the Romantic period, but the unit we are starting in, Realism, is in a lot of ways a reaction to some of the ideals of Romanticism. So it's really important for us to understand what was going on in the Romantic period in American literature in the context of history. And the first couple authors that we're reading, we're going to see some of that transition from the Romantics to the Realists. So again, just another reason for us to review this. If you've taken American Lit 1, then you're familiar with this. This time period, Romanticism goes from 1820 to 1865. The significance of 1820 is actually the publication of Washington Irving's sketchbook, including stories like Rip Van Winkle and Sleepy Hollow, excuse me, and that's just considered important as one of the first Romantic publications. And then 1865 is, of course, the end of the Civil War. So some characteristics of literature, this is really, we're not going to talk so much about the historical context as what's happening with Romantic literature. And first and foremost, we see an idealism. And if you do think about the historical context, this should make a lot of sense because, of course, in the late 1700s was the birth of America as a country, and it was an extraordinary birth. We had just defeated, like how I said we, because, it's like we were all there. We had just defeated the greatest military force in the world, and that was pretty significant for a little band of rebels to do so and to declare their independence from Great Britain. And so that carried over into a lot of the literature, as in America was this place of infinite possibility and a place of real, if you wanted to do something, you could. And people could, just kind of the seed of that American dream happening here. So we see that in a lot of literature. We also see with the Romantics a love of nature. If you've ever read anything by Thoreau, he's the guy who went and lived in the woods, by himself at Walden Pond. And so a lot of the Romantics wrote about nature and just how they were connected to nature and communed with nature. We also see an emphasis on imagination. We see more supernatural elements in Romantic literature. And there's also a good deal of symbolism in Romanticism. You may have read The Scarlet Letter. In fact, you probably did in high school as kind of one of the primary romantic novels in American literature. And you probably remember your teacher talking about how the A can symbolize all these different things. And you could go on, and you might have you may have thought your teacher was stretching that a little bit, but it really was a component of the literature that it was highly symbolic. And then finally, something that's important in Romanticism is the Transcendentalist movement, which the literary name that we associate that with the Transcendentalists is Emerson. And really the primary tenet, what you need to remember with Transcendentalism, is that they thought that humanity, to be human, was to be like God, and that humans were inherently good, and we could continue to make ourselves inherently better. And here we really see a shift in American thought from a foundation of faith and religion towards more of a humanist movement. And all that humanist means is human-centered. And so we see that shift with the Romantics away from a more faith-based culture and towards a more humanistic culture and more of an emphasis on the self and perfecting oneself and just focusing in that way. So that's Romanticism. And so we're going to see a swing from these ideas to some new ideas in realism, which is where we are jumping in. And with realism, I'm going to go a little more in depth here. So let me start with the dates and some historical context. So realism starts at the end of the Civil War to 1914, which is the beginning of World War I. And I hope you can see that, there are big events that shift thought in American literature. And obviously, the Civil War, in so many ways, put an end to that idealism, right? We thought we were this amazing nation of infinite possibility. Well, then we almost tore each other apart, and it just was awful. And so that kind of was a shot of realism in the arm to the United States. So we have this shift in thought right after the Civil War. Some other things going on in this time period, we do have a huge move westward. They're building that infrastructure out west with the railroads and making it more accessible. And so we will have some stories that we read that are set out west and see some of that culture develop. There's also a huge influx of immigrants during this time. And that, again, historically, that should make sense to you because during the Civil War, nobody really wanted to come over to America because, we were shooting each other. And once that is resolved and the Union has been maintained, then those floodgates kind of open back up and we see a lot more immigration. We also have the Industrial Revolution in this time period, which is a movement, a shift away from a more agricultural-based society towards a more industrial. So basically the advent of factories, and so there's more work to be had in the cities. So to come to America, to be successful, to live in this nation, you didn't have to be a farmer. You could be a factory worker. You could have any number of jobs and be successful. And that brought its own set of challenges, which we'll read about some of that. We also see capitalism really taking off. Some of the capitalist giants of this time period, you'd recognize names like Rockefeller, like the newspapermen like Pulitzer and Hearst were big in this time period. So it was a time of growing wealth for many in the United States. This was also a time where we were growing by leaps and bounds in the area of inventions and technological advances. We have Edison, the Wright brothers, who, of course, if you've ever been to Kitty Hawk and seen, where they took their first flight, we have Ford automobiles becoming more affordable and accessible to larger numbers of people. So just a lot of movement in this time period. We also have a rise in magazines as popular literature. And again, with the Industrial Revolution, printing becomes cheaper. And because of that, it's, first of all, easier to get published. So these magazines and these journals they're looking for authors. So that opens the door, especially for a lot of women, to have their work published where they otherwise may have been denied based on gender. And also, these magazines and journals are more affordable to the public, so we have a wider audience for our authors. All right, then we move on to characteristics of literature in realism. So first and foremost, and I hope you see the swing here, away from the idealism of the Romantics to presenting life as it is. So, and that's hence the name of this time period, realism. They wanted to be realistic. And so here we have authors talking about things like, divorce, death, injustice in social classes, injustice in race. Obviously, I feel like I keep talking about Huckleberry Finn in this class, but one of the biggest novels in this time period, and it's about the racial injustice of its time. And Mark Twain didn't pull any punches. He wanted to present life as it is. There was no sugarcoating anything, and that's what the realist authors really wanted to do. They wanted to be true to life, and they sought to do that through their stories. We also see more of an emphasis on character than in plot in a lot of our stories and even in the poetry. We see authors that want to get into their character's psyche. We'll see this in The Awakening when we read that novel, that the book is not so much about what happens to Edna or what she does, but is about what makes her tick. What's going on in her brain? What's going on in her soul that she's wrestling so much with her identity in life? And so much more so than the Romantic authors, we see the realistic authors diving into character development. Their writing style becomes more natural, and I don't know if you've ever heard the term vernacular before, but that just means the way that people would speak conversationally. And that was a new thing in American literature, and we'll talk about this with Mark Twain and Joel Chandler Harris when they have their characters actually speaking. They're writing their characters in the same way they would speak, using words that aren't real words. Strictly according to the dictionary. And so that was a new thing in realistic literature. Writers also wanted to be objective. They felt like a lot of the romantics had maybe been a little on the nose with their themes and the messages they were trying to get across. So this goes along with presenting life as it is. They just wanted to tell this story. They didn't want to tell their readers how to think about what was going on. They just wanted to tell you, essentially present the story they were trying to tell. Some common subjects in this literature, we'll see social class is a big one. Local color, we'll talk about that. And then obviously gender and race issues are coming to the forefront in this period in American history. And then finally, and this is really fascinating to me, we see some American character types established. Now that the United States has been around for a longer period of time, we see the unique elements of American voice that make it distinctive from any other country. One example would be the American cowboy, right? You don't meet a cowboy in Europe. You don't meet a cowboy really anywhere else. But those types of character types starting to grow out of our culture and establish themselves as uniquely American. So hopefully all this makes sense to you. You can let me know if you have questions. I just want to give you all that quick overview so that next week when we jump into the literature that you're prepared and you have this context. Thanks for listening.